Lady Aurelia Blackwood emerges from the shadows of a privileged but emotionally barren childhood to inherit one of Britain's most substantial fortunes at 21. Raised in the sprawling Gothic estate of Ravenshallow after her parents' mysterious death in a sailing accident, Aurelia has been groomed by cold guardians and calculating trustees to become the perfect heiress. Her world is one of immaculate surfaces hiding fundamental emptiness, where every relationship is transactional and every emotion is carefully managed for public consumption. As she prepares for her debut into London society, the weight of expectation and the suffocating nature of her wealth become apparent. The chapter introduces the central paradox. Aurelia possesses everything money can buy, yet lacks everything that makes life meaningful. Through vivid descriptions of Ravenshallow's opulent rooms and Aurelia's internal landscape, we establish the contrast between external grandeur and internal desolation that will drive the entire narrative. The chapter concludes with Aurelia's first public appearance as an adult heiress, where she meets the man who will become her first husband, setting the stage for a pattern of relationships built on mutual need rather than genuine affection. The morning mist clung to Ravenshallow's ancient stones like the ghosts of centuries past, and Aurelia Blackwood stood at her bedroom window, watching the groundskeepers tend to gardens that had been manicured to perfection for 300 years. At 21, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that photographers called aristocratic, all sharp cheekbones and pale skin that seemed to glow from within. But her eyes, a startling shade of violet that had been remarked upon since childhood, held a depth of weariness that belonged to someone much older. Today marked the end of her mourning period for guardians who had never truly lived, and the beginning of her official entry into a society that had been watching her from the shadows since birth. The Blackwood fortune was legendary, built on shipping, steel, and strategic marriages that had consolidated wealth across generations. Now it all rested on her shoulders, a burden disguised as privilege. Mrs. Pemberton, her companion and the closest thing to family she had known, entered the room carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. The trustees are waiting in the library. Lady Aurelia. The final transfer papers require your signature. Aurelia turned from the window, her silk dressing gown rustling like autumn leaves. "Tell me again why I need trustees, Mrs. Pemberton. It's my money, isn't it?" The older woman's face remained diplomatically neutral. "Your parents wanted to ensure the fortune would be protected. These gentlemen have managed the Blackwood interests for decades. They know what's best. They know what's profitable," Aurelia thought, but she kept her expression serene. She had learned early that showing emotion was a luxury the wealthy couldn't afford. It gave others leverage, and leverage was the only currency that mattered more than money itself. The library at Ravenshallow was a cathedral of leather and mahogany, its walls lined with first editions that no one had read in generations. 3 men in identical dark suits sat around the massive oak table, their faces wearing the practiced expressions of those who made their living managing other people's inheritances. At the head sat Mr. Ashworth, the senior trustee, a man whose smile never reached his calculating eyes. Lady Aurelia. Ashworth rose as she entered, his voice carrying the false warmth of a practiced courtier. "How lovely you look today. Shall we proceed with the formalities?" Aurelia took her place at the table, acutely aware that despite being the wealthiest person in the room, she was also the least powerful. The documents spread before her represented not just financial assets, but the architecture of her entire future, trusts and conditions, marriage clauses and inheritance provisions that had been designed to control her long after the men who wrote them were dead. "The principal sum stands at approximately £200 million, Ashworth continued, his fingers dancing across spreadsheets with practiced ease. "The annual income from investments should provide you with roughly $15 million per year, more than sufficient for maintaining your lifestyle and social obligations." Social obligations. The phrase hung in the air like incense in a church, heavy with unspoken expectations. Aurelia knew what those obligations entailed: charitable patronage, strategic friendships, and ultimately, a marriage that would merge her fortune with another established family. Love was never mentioned in these discussions, only compatibility and mutual benefit. As she signed document after document, Aurelia felt each signature binding her more tightly to a life she had never chosen. The irony wasn't lost on her that inheriting everything meant losing control of anything. She was wealthy beyond most people's dreams, yet her choices were more constrained than those of her own servants. "There is one more matter," Ashworth said as she finished the final signature. "The London season begins next month. We've arranged for you to stay at the Belgravia House. There are several social events where your presence would be advantageous." Aurelia looked up from the papers, meeting his gaze directly. "Advantageous to whom, Mr. Ashworth?" His smile flickered momentarily. "To the preservation of the Blackwood legacy, naturally. Your parents would have wanted you to take your proper place in society. Her parents, the couple she barely remembered, who had died in a sailing accident when she was 8, leaving her to be raised by guardians who viewed her more as an investment than a child. Their portraits hung in the great hall, beautiful and remote, watching over a house that had never felt like home. That evening, as Aurelia walked through Ravenshallow's endless corridors, she passed room after room filled with treasures, accumulated over generations. Paintings by masters whose names were whispered in auction houses, furniture that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, jewelry that had adorned queens and courtesans. All of it beautiful, all of it valuable, all of it as cold and lifeless as the stones that built the house itself. In her private sitting room, she opened the letter that had arrived that afternoon, an invitation to Lady Pembroke's charity gala in London. The cream paper felt heavy in her hands, weighted with expectation. This would be her first major social appearance as an adult, her debut as not just an heiress, but as a potential bride for the right sort of man. The thought made her stomach clench with something between anticipation and dread. Mrs. Pemberton found her there an hour later, still holding the invitation. "You're thinking too much again, dear. It's not becoming in a young lady." "What if I don't want to go?" Aurelia asked quietly. "What if I want to travel, or study, or do something with my life besides attend parties and marry well?" The older woman sat beside her, her expression softening for the first time that day. "My dear child, you have been given a great gift. With great wealth comes great responsibility. You cannot simply disappear into obscurity. Too many people depend on the Blackwood fortune for their livelihoods. The estate employs hundreds. The investments support thousands. You are not just an heiress. You are a steward of something much larger than yourself." Aurelia understood the logic, even as she resented it. She was trapped by her own privilege, a bird in a golden cage that was too beautiful to break and too small to truly live in. The fortune that should have given her freedom had instead made her a prisoner of expectations and obligations. Later that night, alone in her vast bedroom, Aurelia stood before the mirror that had reflected generations of Blackwood women. She saw in her reflection not just her own face, but the weight of history, the accumulated dreams and disappointments of all the women who had come before her. They had all faced the same choices, made the same compromises, lived the same carefully orchestrated lives. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey to London, to take her place in a society that would evaluate her, worth not by her thoughts or dreams, but by her fortune and her potential as a wife. She would smile and charm and play the role that had been written for her long before she was born. But tonight, in the privacy of her room, she allowed herself to mourn the life she would never have, the life of a woman who belonged to herself rather than to a legacy. The mist outside her window was beginning to lift, revealing the manicured perfection of the grounds below. Soon the sun would rise on another day of beautiful, empty privilege, and Aurelia Blackwood, the last of her line and the richest woman of her generation, would continue the performance that had been passed down through her family like a precious heirloom, the art of living magnificently while dying slowly inside. As she finally prepared for bed, Aurelia caught sight of a small photograph on her dressing table, the only picture she had of her parents where they looked genuinely happy. They were laughing at something beyond the camera's view, their faces bright with unguarded joy. She wondered if they had ever felt trapped by their wealth, if they had ever dreamed of escape. Perhaps their sailing accident hadn't been an accident at all, but the only freedom they could find. The thought should have horrified her, but instead it brought a strange comfort. Even golden cages, it seemed, could not hold everyone forever. Chapter 2. The Charming Predator. 6 months into London society, Aurelia has mastered the art of being the perfect heiress while feeling increasingly hollow inside. At a prestigious charity auction, she encounters Marcus Thornfield, a devastatingly charming entrepreneur 15 years her senior, who seems different from the titled fortune hunters circling her. Marcus appears to value her intelligence and independence, offering partnership rather than protection. Their whirlwind courtship feels like the first genuine connection of her life, and she marries him in a private ceremony that scandalizes society but fills her with hope. However, the honeymoon period reveals Marcus's true nature. He's a sophisticated con artist who has researched her weaknesses and crafted his persona to exploit them. As Aurelia discovers the extent of his financial manipulations and realizes she's been systematically isolated from her support network, she begins to understand that her wealth has made her a target rather than a prize. The chapter culminates in a confrontation where Marcus reveals his contempt for her naivety, leading to a struggle that ends with his death in what appears to be a tragic accident. Aurelia's transformation from victim to survivor begins, but so does her reputation as a woman whose husbands meet untimely ends. The charity auction was everything Aurelia had learned to expect from London society, a carefully orchestrated performance where the wealthy displayed their generosity as publicly as their jewels. She sat at a table near the front, her presence alone worth thousands in donations, simply because her attendance legitimized the event. The Blackwood name on the guest list opened checkbooks across the room. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, a week at a private villa in Tuscany donated by Mr. Marcus Thornfield. Aurelia looked up from her champagne as a man rose from a table across the room. Marcus Thornfield was handsome in an unconventional way, not the soft, aristocratic features she was accustomed to, but something sharper, more vital. His dark hair was slightly too long, his smile slightly too knowing, and when his eyes met hers across the crowded ballroom, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months of careful social interactions, genuine interest. The bidding was spirited, but Aurelia found herself raising her paddle almost without conscious thought. When she won at £15,000, far more than the villa was worth, Marcus's smile widened, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement. The gesture felt like a private conversation in a room full of strangers. "Quite an expensive vacation," a voice said beside her. Lord Pemberton, one of her trustees' preferred suitors, had materialized at her elbow with the persistence of a well-dressed fungus. "Though I suppose money is no object for someone in your position." Aurelia's smile never wavered, though inwardly she recoiled from his presumption. "It's for charity, Lord Pemberton. The cause is what matters." "Of course," he agreed, his hand settling possessively on the back of her chair. "Though I can't help but notice you've been rather selective in your social commitments lately. Perhaps you'd allow me to escort you to the Whitmore ball next week?" Before Aurelia could formulate a polite refusal, another voice intervened. "I believe the lady is otherwise engaged that evening." Marcus Thornfield stood behind her chair, his presence commanding without being aggressive. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he assessed Lord Pemberton with the cool calculation of a predator, sizing up potential prey. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Pemberton said stiffly, his territorial instincts clearly activated. Marcus Thornfield. He extended his hand with casual confidence. And you must be, Lord Pemberton. I've heard so much about your various interests. There was something in his tone that made Pemberton flush and excuse himself with unseemly haste. Aurelia found herself both impressed and slightly unnerved by the display. That was expertly done, she said as Marcus took the vacated seat beside her. Though I'm curious what you've heard about his interests. Nothing that would be appropriate to discuss in such refined company, Marcus replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Though I suspect you're far too intelligent to have been taken in by his particular brand of charm. The conversation that followed was unlike any Aurelia had experienced in months of London society. Marcus spoke to her as an equal, asking her opinions on business matters, discussing politics with the assumption that she had thoughts worth hearing. When he mentioned his work developing sustainable energy projects, she found herself genuinely engaged for the first time in months. You're not what I expected, she admitted as the evening wound down. What did you expect? Another fortune hunter, another man who sees pound signs when he looks at me. Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. I see a woman who's been treated like a commodity for so long she's forgotten she's a person. That must be exhausting. The simple acknowledgement of her reality hit her like a physical blow. No one had ever articulated what she felt so precisely, so kindly. When Marcus asked if she'd like to have dinner the following evening, not at a society restaurant where they'd be photographed and gossiped about, but at a small place in Notting Hill where they could actually talk, she said yes without hesitation. Their courtship unfolded over 6 intense weeks that felt like a revelation. Marcus was everything the men in her usual circle were not: self-made, passionate about his work, unimpressed by titles and traditions. He treated her wealth as incidental rather than central to her identity, seemed more interested in her thoughts than her trust fund. When he took her to his modest flat in Chelsea, furnished with books and art rather than inherited antiques, Aurelia felt like she was seeing a different way of living for the first time. You could have anyone, she said one evening as they sat by his fireplace, her head on his shoulder. Why me? Because you're real, he replied, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. Underneath all the careful breeding and social programming, there's something authentic, something worth saving. The word saving should have set off alarm bells, but Aurelia was too intoxicated by the feeling of being truly seen to analyze his choice of language. When Marcus proposed a month later, not with a family ring or a public spectacle, but with a simple solitaire diamond and a quiet declaration of love in his living room, she said yes with tears streaming down her face. Their wedding was a small affair that scandalized society precisely as Marcus had predicted it would. Let them talk, he said as they danced at their reception, held in the garden of a country inn rather than Westminster Abbey. We're building something new, something that belongs to us. For the first 3 months of marriage, Aurelia believed she had found her escape from the golden cage. Marcus moved into the Belgravia house, but made no changes to accommodate his presence, claiming he wanted to respect her space. He seemed genuinely interested in her charitable work, even suggesting ways she could make her donations more effective. When he proposed they take a honeymoon in Italy, using her prize from the auction as a starting point, she was touched by his thoughtfulness. The cracks began to show in Tuscany. Small things at first: Marcus's irritation when she wanted to visit museums instead of staying at the villa, his insistence on handling all the arrangements and expenses, his subtle criticism of her sheltered perspectives on art and culture. When she tried to pay for dinner at a restaurant he'd chosen, his smile turned cold. I may not have your family's money, darling, but I can afford to take my wife to dinner. The possessiveness in his voice was new and unsettling, but Aurelia told herself she was being oversensitive, that Marcus was simply adjusting to their new dynamic. It wasn't until they returned to London that the real scope of his deception became clear. Going through the mail that had accumulated during their absence, Aurelia found several urgent messages from her bank. When she called to inquire, she learned that significant transfers had been made from her accounts, transfers authorized by her husband as her financial representative. "There must be some mistake," she told the bank manager. "I never gave my husband access to my accounts. According to our records, Mrs. Thornfield, you signed the authorization forms 3 weeks ago. Your husband presented them along with your marriage certificate and identification." Aurelia's hands shook as she hung up the phone. She had never signed any such forms, which meant Marcus had forged her signature and done it well enough to fool banking professionals. When she confronted him that evening, his response was a masterclass in manipulation. "Darling, you're being paranoid," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone one might use with a child. "I moved some funds to better investment vehicles. I'm trying to help you, to protect what's yours." "It's not yours to protect," Aurelia said, her voice stronger than she felt. "And I never gave you permission." Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Then the charming smile returned, but it no longer reached his eyes. "You're upset. It's understandable. You've never had to think about money management before. But you're my wife now, Aurelia. We're partners. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours." "What exactly is yours, Marcus?" she asked, a terrible clarity beginning to dawn. "Your flat is rented. Your car is leased. Your business. Do you even have a business?" The silence that followed was answer enough. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of affection. "You really are as naive as they said you'd be. Did you honestly think someone like me would fall in love with someone like you? You're a spoiled little rich girl who's never had to work for anything in her life. But you're not stupid, Aurelia. You know exactly what this is." The cruelty in his voice was like a physical blow, but it also brought a strange relief. The confusion and self-doubt of the past weeks crystallized into something much simpler: rage. "Get out," she said quietly. "I don't think so." Marcus poured himself a drink from her crystal decanter, his movements casual and confident. "I've put considerable effort into this relationship. I'm not walking away empty-handed. You've already stolen enough." "Stolen?" He laughed, a sound without warmth. "I've barely scratched the surface. You have no idea how easy this has been, how perfectly you've played your part. The lonely heiress, desperate for genuine affection, willing to trust anyone who treated her like a person instead of a bank account." Each word was calculated to wound, and they succeeded. But underneath the pain, Aurelia felt something harder crystallizing, a determination she hadn't known she possessed. "I'll expose you. I'll tell everyone what you are." "Will you?" Marcus set down his glass and moved toward her, his expression shifting to something genuinely threatening. "And what will you tell them, exactly? That you were foolish enough to marry a con artist? That the great Blackwood heiress was taken in by the first man who paid her a compliment? You'll be a laughingstock, Aurelia, and I'll still have access to your accounts." He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, the same scent that had once made her feel safe and desired. Now it made her nauseous. When he reached for her, whether to comfort or control, Aurelia's body reacted before her mind could intervene. She stepped back, her heel catching on the edge of the Persian rug. Marcus, reaching for her arm, was thrown off balance by her sudden movement. He stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him toward the marble fireplace. The sound of his head striking the stone was sickeningly final. Aurelia stood frozen, watching blood pool beneath Marcus's still form. She should have felt horror, or guilt, or panic. Instead, she felt only a vast, echoing emptiness. Her first genuine love had been a lie, her first marriage a fraud, and now her first husband was dead on her living room floor. When she finally called for help, her voice was steady, her story simple. Her husband had been drinking, had tripped on the rug, had hit his head. An accident. tragic, and sudden. The police were sympathetic, the coroner's report straightforward. Marcus Thornfield, age 36, death by misadventure. At the funeral, attended by the few people who had known Marcus's public persona, Aurelia played the grieving widow with a skill that surprised her. She wore black Chanel and carried white roses, accepted condolences with appropriate dignity, and never once let her expression reveal the complex mixture of relief and devastation churning inside her. But London society noticed. They always did. The beautiful young heiress who had married beneath her station and been widowed within 6 months became the subject of whispered speculation. Some called it tragic. Others called it suspicious. And a few, with the cruelty that only the very wealthy could afford, began to call her Lady Killmore. The name would stick, though Aurelia didn't know it yet. She was too busy learning the first lesson of her new life, that survival sometimes required becoming someone you never thought you could be. And that money, rather than protecting her from the world's cruelties, had made her a target for them. As she sat in her empty house the night after the funeral, Aurelia understood that her transformation was just beginning. The naive girl who had believed in love was dead, buried with Marcus Thornfield. What remained was harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The golden cage had not been destroyed. It had simply changed shape. Chapter 3, The Politician's Gambit. 2 years after Marcus's death, Aurelia has retreated from society, but her isolation is interrupted by the persistent courtship of Sir Richard Pemberton, a rising political star with genuine aristocratic credentials and seemingly honorable intentions. Unlike Marcus, Richard appears to offer everything Aurelia thought she wanted: respectability, social position, and what seems like genuine affection. Their marriage is a grand affair that restores her reputation and elevates his political career. However, Richard's true nature emerges gradually. He is coldly ambitious, using their marriage as a stepping stone to higher office, while systematically isolating Aurelia from any independent agency. When she discovers his involvement in a corruption scandal that could destroy both their reputations, she realizes she must choose between protecting herself and protecting him. The chapter builds to a climactic confrontation during a political dinner party where Richard's hypocrisy and cruelty are fully revealed. His death, a heart attack brought on by a confrontation with evidence of his crimes, appears natural, but leaves Aurelia facing the reality that she is becoming something she never intended to be. The pattern is now undeniable, and society's whispers are growing louder. The House of Commons was buzzing with the particular energy that preceded a major vote, and Aurelia sat in the gallery reserved for members' families, watching her husband command the chamber with the natural authority that had first attracted her to him. Sir Richard Pemberton, he'd been knighted the previous year for his service to the party, was everything Marcus had pretended to be: genuinely accomplished, socially connected, and apparently devoted to causes larger than himself. 3 years of marriage had restored Aurelia's reputation and elevated Richard's career in equal measure. Their wedding had been the society event of the decade, photographed for Tatler and Vogue, attended by cabinet ministers and foreign dignitaries. The Blackwood fortune, combined with Richard's political acumen, had created a power couple that dominated London's social and political landscape. Yet as Aurelia watched her husband deliver his speech on financial reform, a speech she had helped write, though he would never acknowledge her contribution, she felt the familiar emptiness that had become her constant companion. The golden cage had simply acquired new bars, more elegant but no less confining. "Magnificent as always," murmured Lady Ashworth, seated beside her in the gallery. "You must be so proud." Aurelia smiled the practiced smile she'd perfected over years of public appearances. "Richard is dedicated to serving the country. It's inspiring to watch." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Richard was dedicated to serving Richard, using his position and her money to build a political empire that would eventually carry him to Downing Street. Everything else, including their marriage, was simply a means to that end. After the session, Aurelia met Richard in his office, a wood-paneled sanctuary that smelled of leather and ambition. He was reviewing papers with his chief of staff, James Morrison, a thin man with calculating eyes who had never bothered to hide his disdain for Aurelia's influence on policy matters. "Darling," Richard said without looking up, "excellent turnout in the gallery today. The press noticed your presence. It adds gravitas to the proceedings." Gravitas, as if she were a prop in his political theater. "I found your speech compelling," she said carefully, "though I wondered about the section on banking regulations. Given your recent meetings with the Meridian Group, some might question the consistency of your position." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. James Morrison looked up from his papers, his expression alert. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he dismissed his aide with a curt nod. "We'll continue this tomorrow, James." When they were alone, Richard's mask of political charm slipped away, revealing something much colder underneath. "What do you know about Meridian?" "I know they've made substantial donations to your campaign fund," Aurelia replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I also know they're under investigation for money laundering, the same banking practices you just condemned in Parliament." Richard moved to the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in the pose he adopted when calculating his next move. "Politics requires compromise, Aurelia. The world isn't as simple as your charitable committees would have you believe. Compromise is one thing. Hypocrisy is another." She kept her voice level, but something in her tone made him turn. "The Meridian Group is using our foundation as a front for illegal activities. My name is on those documents, Richard. My reputation." "Your reputation?" He laughed, a sound without humor. "Your reputation was in tatters before you married me. The grieving widow who couldn't keep a husband alive for more than 6 months. I rebuilt your standing, made you respectable again. You owe me everything." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow, but Aurelia had learned not to show weakness. "I owe you nothing. My money funded your campaigns, my connections opened doors you could never have reached alone. We were supposed to be partners." "Partners?" Richard's voice dropped to the dangerous quiet he used in committee hearings when destroying an opponent. "You're my wife, Aurelia. A beautiful, wealthy wife who adds credibility to my public image. But you are not my partner. You are an asset, and assets don't question strategy." The words crystallized everything she had been trying not to acknowledge for months. Richard saw her exactly as Marcus had, as a means to an end, a beautiful facade concealing the wealth and influence he needed to achieve his ambitions. The only difference was that Richard's theft was legal, sanctioned by marriage vows and social expectations. "I won't be part of this," she said quietly. "If you continue taking money from Meridian, I'll withdraw my support. Publicly." Richard studied her for a long moment, and when he smiled, it was the predatory expression she'd seen him use against political rivals. "No, you won't. Because if you do, I'll make sure everyone knows about your first husband's real business activities. The forensic accountants I hired found very interesting patterns in Marcus Thornfield's financial dealings, patterns that suggest his widow might have known more about his operations than she admitted to the police. The threat hung between them like poison gas. Aurelia felt her carefully constructed world tilt on its axis. "You investigated Marcus?" "I investigate everyone who poses a potential threat to my career. Your late husband was running a sophisticated fraud operation, taking money from investors across Europe. The police investigation was remarkably superficial, almost as if someone with influence had encouraged them not to dig too deeply. The implication was clear. Richard believed she had been complicit in Marcus's crimes and had used her wealth and connections to avoid prosecution. The truth, that she had been as much a victim as anyone else, wouldn't matter if he decided to destroy her. "You're bluffing," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Shall we test that theory? I have friends at the Telegraph who would be very interested in this story. Lady Killmore, grieving widow or criminal accomplice. It has a nice ring to it." That evening, they attended a dinner party at the Foreign Secretary's residence, playing their roles as the perfect political couple. Aurelia smiled and made conversation about art and charity work, while Richard held court with cabinet ministers and party donors. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of successful partnership, wealth and power united in service to the nation. But beneath the surface, war had been declared. Over the following weeks, Aurelia began her own investigation, using resources Richard didn't know she possessed. What she found was worse than she had imagined. The Meridian Group wasn't just laundering money, they were funding arms dealers and human traffickers, using her charitable foundation as a front for activities that would have sickened her if she'd known about them. The evidence was damning, but it was also dangerous. If exposed, the scandal would destroy Richard's career and potentially land them both in prison. But if she remained silent, she would be complicit in genuine evil, her family's legacy forever tainted by association with criminals. The decision came to a head during a private dinner party at their Belgravia house, attended by senior party officials and major donors. Richard was in his element, charming and confident, discussing policy with the easy authority of someone born to lead. Aurelia played her part, the gracious hostess ensuring everyone's comfort while saying nothing of substance. But when Marcus Whitfield, one of the Meridian Group's principals, made a casual comment about expanding their charitable partnerships, something inside Aurelia snapped. She excused herself from the table and went to Richard's study, where she retrieved the files she had been gathering for weeks. When she returned to the dining room, the conversation had turned to Richard's prospects for higher office. Prime Minister Pemberton has a nice ring to it, someone was saying, and the laughter that followed was rich with anticipation. Before we discuss Richard's future, Aurelia said, her voice cutting through the jovial atmosphere like a blade, perhaps we should address his present associations. She placed the files on the table, their contents spilling out like accusations. Bank statements, wire transfers, photographs of meetings that were supposed to have been secret. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went through several colors before settling on a dangerous shade of red. "Aurelia, what are you doing?" "I'm showing our guests what their donations are really funding," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Arms dealers in Syria. Human traffickers in Eastern Europe. All of it laundered through our foundation, all of it bearing my family's name." The political calculus in the room was almost visible as careers and reputations hung in the balance. Marcus Whitfield was the first to leave, claiming a sudden illness. Others followed in rapid succession, their farewells curt and their expressions carefully neutral. When the last guest had departed, Richard turned on her with a fury that was all the more terrifying for being so controlled. "You've destroyed everything," he said quietly. 20 years of building my career, and you've destroyed it in one evening." "I've saved my soul," Aurelia replied, "something you sold long ago." Richard moved toward her, his hands shaking with rage. "You naive, sanctimonious bitch. Do you think your hands are clean? Do you think your precious family fortune was built on anything more noble than what I've done? Your ancestors were slave traders and opium dealers, but you wear their blood money like a crown and dare to judge me?" The words struck home because they contained enough truth to wound. But Aurelia had learned something in the years since Marcus's death. Sometimes the only choice was between different kinds of guilt. "At least I'm trying to do better. You're just trying to do more." "Better?" Richard laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You've killed 2 husbands, Aurelia, 2 men who made the mistake of trying to love you. Or use you. Does it even matter which? You're poison, wrapped in silk and diamonds. You destroy everything you touch." The accusation hit her like a physical blow, because she had wondered the same thing in her darkest moments. But seeing Richard's face, twisted with hatred and desperation, she understood something she had never admitted to herself. She wasn't the poison. She was the cure for men like him, the price they paid for their greed and ambition. "Maybe I am," she said quietly, "but at least I'm honest about what I am. You're a fraud, Richard. A small man pretending to be great, using my money and my name to build something that was never yours." Richard's face went purple, his breathing becoming labored. He clutched at his chest, his eyes wide with shock and pain. You can't. This isn't." He collapsed, his body hitting the Persian rug with a dull thud. Aurelia knelt beside him, checking for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find. Richard's heart, weakened by years of stress and ambition, had finally given out under the weight of his own corruption. As she waited for the paramedic she had called, Aurelia felt a familiar emptiness settling over her. 3 husbands, 3 deaths, 3 different kinds of betrayal. The pattern was unmistakable now, and so were the whispers that would follow. Lady Killmore had struck again. And this time, the victim was a knight of the realm. The investigation that followed was more thorough than the previous ones, but the conclusion was the same: natural causes, brought on by stress and underlying health conditions. The Meridian Group scandal broke the following week, but Richard's death meant he couldn't be held accountable for his part in it. His reputation remained largely intact, preserved by the careful amnesia that protected the political class. Aurelia inherited his estate, modest by her standards but significant enough to add to the whispers about her motives. She also inherited something more valuable and dangerous, the knowledge that she was becoming exactly what society said she was. Not a victim of circumstance, but an agent of consequence. A woman whose very presence seemed to be lethal to the men who tried to possess her. The golden cage had not been destroyed. It had simply revealed its true nature, not a prison, but a weapon. And Aurelia was finally learning how to use it. Chapter 4. The Artist's Obsession. Summary: 5 years after Richard's death, Aurelia has embraced her reputation as Lady Killmore, using it as both shield and sword to navigate a world that fears and desires her in equal measure. She meets Gabriel Ashworth, a brilliant but unstable artist 20 years her junior, who becomes obsessed with her dark legend. Unlike her previous husbands who wanted her money or status, Gabriel wants her mythology. He sees her as his muse, his masterpiece, his path to artistic immortality. Their relationship is passionate and destructive, fueled by Gabriel's addiction to both substances and the dangerous game of loving someone with her reputation. As Gabriel's art becomes increasingly disturbing, depicting scenes of death and betrayal that mirror Aurelia's past, she realizes he is not just documenting her story, but trying to become part of it. The chapter builds to a horrifying climax when Gabriel, in a drug-fueled psychotic episode, attempts to kill Aurelia to complete his artistic vision, believing that only by dying at her hands can he achieve the immortality he craves. His death, in what appears to be a struggle for survival, finally forces Aurelia to confront the truth about what she has become and what she must do to break the cycle. The art opening was deliberately provocative, which was exactly what Aurelia had intended when she agreed to host it. Memento Mori, Death in the Digital Age, was the kind of exhibition that attracted both serious collectors and sensation seekers, the perfect cover for what had become her new identity, the wealthy widow who courted controversy because she had nothing left to lose. At 49, Aurelia had grown into her reputation as Lady Killmore, with the same calculated precision she had once applied to charity galas. Her beauty had sharpened rather than faded, her features acquiring an austere elegance that photographers called haunting. She wore her notoriety like couture, perfectly fitted and impossible to ignore. The gallery buzzed with opening night energy, champagne glasses catching the harsh light of the installations. Death masks made from recycled smartphones, sculptures of extinct species rendered in precious metals, video loops of famous last words. It was art designed to make the comfortable uncomfortable, and Aurelia moved through it with the ease of someone who had made peace with mortality. "Lady Pemberton," a young man's voice cut through the ambient noise, "I've been hoping to meet you." Aurelia turned to find herself facing the evening's featured artist, Gabriel Ashworth. At 29, he possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that belonged in a pre-Raphaelite painting, all sharp cheekbones and burning eyes, his dark hair falling in waves that suggested he had just risen from bed or was about to return.